Hi, my name is Micah McKay, and I'm coming to you from the University of Alabama. And the talk I'm going to give is called Trash Thresholds in Luis Alberto Urrea's By the Lake of Sleeping Children. Luis Alberto Urrea's 1996 nonfiction book, By the Lake of Sleeping Children, chronicles his time spent working with communities in and around Tijuana throughout the 1980s and early 90s, a moment in which the NAFTA era conceptualization of the U.S. Mexico border was taking shape, a paradoxical conceptualization of the border as a space of unlimited freedom from economic and environmental regulatory restraints on the one hand, and on the other, a regimented, militarized space designed to curtail human freedom through the harsh regulation of the movement of racialized bodies that, it seems important to note, move in pursuit of freedom from violence, oppression, poverty. Many of the episodes that comprise Urrea's book are centered on a community of trash pickers in a dump, or dompe, as Urrea calls it throughout the book, in Tijuana. And in this brief presentation, I'd like to reflect on a few moments in these vignettes that allow us to think through the troubling and mutually imbricated environmental, political, and economic crises that are paradoxically exceptional and exemplary of the current order of things. First, I'll elaborate on the notion of the threshold and its relationship to trash that I invoke in this presentation's title in order to consider the way that Urrea posits the border and the dompe as threshold spaces. Then I'll consider a couple of Urrea's descriptive passages as a way of teasing out the material implications of trash and trash spaces he portrays in his book. Ever since Michel Foucault's initial reflections on biopower in the 1970s, thinkers attracted to the notion of biopolitics have developed a multitude of divergent insights regarding what the French philosopher identified as, and I quote, modernity's explosion of numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugations of bodies and the control of populations, end quote. Among these developments with regard to the materialization of power in and through the body, Giorgio Agamben's concept of the threshold as it relates to the logic of exclusion or exception is of particular interest because, as we'll see, it sheds light on the way trash is produced and people are rendered as trash. For Agamben, the threshold is a key textual and conceptual device that signals the potentiality of a limit, whether positive or negative. In The Coming Community, Agamben clearly identifies the basic logic of linkage inherent to the concept of the threshold, in this case referring to the notion of the outside of something. He says, and I quote, "The outside is not another space that resides beyond a determinate space, but rather it is the passage, the exteriority that gives it access," end quote. In this sense, the threshold, which marks the limit between two things, is not another thing with respect to the limit, as Agamben puts it. It is, so to speak, the experience of the limit itself. He furthers his conceptualization of the threshold in Homo Sacer, where he examines the limit zone between political life and biological life, or bare life, as he calls it. This zone is the domain of sovereign power, a threshold whose logic is not one of opposition, but of abandonment, in which the outside is included through its exclusion. This means that the threshold is a space where inside and outside enter a zone of indistinction. I submit that trash is a material manifestation of the threshold. The logic underlying the latter is strikingly similar to systems that we use in our attempts to distinguish between useful and useless material objects, or rather, things worth keeping and things that are trash. The words Agamben uses to denote the actions that constitute the threshold, abandonment and exclusion, resonate with the gesture that turns a thing into trash, disposal. What is more, the threshold underscores the fundamental connection between things that seem to be disconnected because they are opposed to one another, but are in fact intimately related to one another via the act of exclusion itself. In other words, the concept of the threshold serves to remind us that things don't fall into one category or another because of their inherent qualities. Rather, the categories in which they're included, or from which they are excluded, are a function of the ceaselessly updated mechanism of exclusion. In the same vein, the production of trash is an effect of dynamic, open-ended, always emerging mechanisms of classification. Finally, for Agamben, the threshold is a zone of indistinction, a space in which the difference between things, inside and outside, or political life and bare life, for example, is impossible to identify. Indeterminacy is a key characteristic of trash as well. On a material level, processes like putrefaction and corrosion make it hard to tell what a discarded object once was, or is or once was, a difficulty that's compounded by garbage dumps, which group together discards into, as John Scanlon puts it, a mountain of indistinguishable stuff that is in its own way affirmed by a resolute dismissal. Trash is the material manifestation of the indistinction of the threshold, the in-between that signals the experience of the limit itself. As Scanlon puts it further on, between something and nothing, between whole and part, between the body as a source of unique being and the universal matter of the garbage itself, this stateless condition of being one thing and then another, or being at any time neither one thing nor another, symbolizes garbage. From the outset of his book, Urrea posits his own split identity as a Mexican, as an American, as a Mexican-American, and his childhood in Tijuana and San Diego as occurring in liminal zones between different cultural, affective, and geographic categories. For him, the border is a barbed wire fence that neatly bisects his heart, a phenomenon that simultaneously gathers him into and excludes him from multiple political and social categories. In the first few pages, Urrea also gives a before and after description of his childhood home that I'd like to quote in full. He says, "My first home, where I stumbled into life and first greeted that astonishment of daylight, was on a hill above Tijuana. The house to the east was already giving way to gravity on the day I was born. It slumped downhill, a wooden trapezoid rushing slowly into the dry arroyo beneath our yards. In the shadow of this woozy building, bananas and pomegranates grew. The poor boys and I scrabbled in the dirt and grit of our street, throwing wooden tops to spin in the dust, herding amazingly huge red ants and pillbugs back and forth between the shores, and ambushing each other with bright pink and yellow squirt guns bought at the corner botica for the change left over from the kilo of tortillas we went to buy each afternoon. And today, these many years later, the house next door has settled like a deck of weathered cards. The banana trees are dead and gone. Little boys like me, however, still play on the hillside. These boys have seen things that we did not even dream of. They have watched Desert Storm, Waco, Beirut, Panama, Rwanda, Bosnia, Colosio, the assassination of the Mexican bishop, Israel's Intifada, Rodney King, the LA riots, Oklahoma City, the Chiapas revolt, the Million Man March, the White Ford Bronco, even the autopsy of a reported UFO pilot, all on gringo television, spilling south over the edges of the border as Tijuana's sewage rushes north." End quote. There's quite a bit in this passage that merits attention, but I'd simply like to note the way that Urrea structures his description around a number of borders or fractures, political, temporal, material, cultural, that position his boyhood home, a metonymy of the border itself, in a tenuous threshold zone. Further on in the book, a similar time-lapse description of the impact of neoliberalism on Tijuana's built environment similarly highlights the political, affective, and material instantiations of Urrea's portrayal of the border as threshold, and by including the presence of waste and decay, emphasizes the environmental stakes of modernization. These environmental stakes are made even clearer in the book's many vivid descriptions of the dump and the people who work in it. Throughout, Urrea aims to underline the way that the Dompe occupies a somewhat indeterminate space between past and future, nature and culture, life and death. In an especially horrific sequence, he tells of how recent flooding had unearthed the remains of a number of children who had been buried next to the dump, creating a lake of sorts. This is the Lake of Sleeping Children that gives the book its title. In an area that in some remote pre-dump past would have been a placid waterway that would have attracted desert animals, both human and non-human, and have been home to a number of plant species, but that now contains, as he puts it, Kotex, Keds, Calimán comic books, and ketchup bottles, in addition to human remains. Such a scene is hard to stomach, but Urrea forces the reader to confront it and consider his or her own part in bringing it about. He says, and I quote, "Swim in this lake for a minute. Jump in. You own it. It's Lake NAFTA." End quote. A subsequent vignette in which he tells a story about the dump opens with "Imagine this," a command that invites us as readers to activate our imaginations. At the end of the episode, he concludes with the rhetorical question, "Can you imagine such a scene?" as a way of underscoring the generalized inability to imagine, understand, or identify with what has been told. I think that this command and this question, "Imagine this," and "Can you imagine such a scene?" are key rhetorical elements for framing all of the book's scenes of the Dompe and its role in the life and economy of the border. In this sense, by simultaneously commanding us to enact our imaginative faculties and calling them into question, Urrea signals the representational limits of the scenes he narrates, his ability to narrate them and our ability to perceive them. By the same token, however, it is only through attempting to tell the story and to listen to it that we can glimpse the thresholds that bind us. Thank you very much. I'll leave it there for right now, and I look forward to dialoguing with everyone on this and on everyone else's presentations and interventions. I hope you're all staying safe, and take care.